My Last Duchess. It has been taken from dramatic lyrics and it was published in the year 1842. Before going to this particular text, that is My Last Duchess, the one thing that I should say here, that is My Last Duchess has to be considered as an example, a very good example of dramatic monologue, number one. And I have already told you about dramatic monologue, what are the features of dramatic monologue and how we can classify one particular text as dramatic monologue, what are the basic features and how these can be found in the concerned text or so. So here also you will find a silent listener is being present and he is the envoy, what happens in this particular poem. That here you will find that the speaker is the Duke, and Duke is actually speaking about his last Duchess and what happened to her in front of the person who is an envoy. The envoy who has come there for the particular proposal of marriage that he is actually taking on behalf of the father of the woman or father of the lady. So that's why throughout the poem you will find that this particular person, that is the envoy, he is becoming a silent listener, and therefore it's a single speech that we will find to some extent a kind of a conversation-oriented, conversation-oriented points can be traced in this particular poem. So therefore it's an apt and good example of a dramatic monologue. Now, what happens, in this particular edition, as I've already mentioned, the edition that is considered as worldview edition, here some informations have been provided. Okay, for example, say My Last Duchess. Fundamentally, if you think about Ferreira, if you think about the concept of My Last Duchess, or maybe something related to the dramatic lyrics, there are some information that have been provided in this worldview edition. I am going through a particular section and then I will begin with the text. What it says, you see that the original inspiration of this particular poem, that is My Last Duchess, probably it came from Browning's first visit to Italy in search of material for Sordello, S-O-R-D-E-L-L-O. In 1842, Browning was reviewing a book about Tasso. Tasso, he's actually a Renaissance artist actually. And in looking up the life of Tasso, he came upon a brief account of Alfonso II. Okay, Alfonso II was actually the 5th Duke of Ferrara. Ferrara is the place actually, and he was the patron of Tasso. Now the Duke actually married Lucrezia, L-U-C-R-E-Z-I-A, Lucrezia, the 14-year-old daughter of Cosimo I di Medici. I repeat, Cosimo I di Medici. He was the Duke of Florence, who later died of poisoning. So therefore, the Duke of Ferrara probably inspired the speaker in the particular poem. Now, what happens here, you see that there is a particular reference to the Duke, who is Alfonso II, that is the 5th Duke of Ferrara, who killed to some extent, you see, because, regarding this particular kind of killing or these poisoning and so, these have become some myths to some extent. And you can find, yes, there are some historical orientation to this particular text. And whenever we try to find them, we find that this particular text is actually being based on a real life incident that actually happened there. Okay, so that's why it's been stated that the Duke married Lucrezia. Lucrezia was the 14-year-old daughter of Cosimo I di Medici. He was the Duke of Florence, and this lady actually died of poisoning. Okay, so therefore a particular killing orientation is there. You see, this is number one, that is regarding the particular concept of My Last Duchess, that who the Duchess is, and fundamentally who is this Duke of Ferrara, and therefore he is a killer. Okay, the poem appeared in dramatic lyrics, as I mentioned just now, and in 1842 and 1845, Browning gathered together his shorter, less ambitious poems under the titles of dramatic lyrics and dramatic romances and lyrics respectively. They were published as the third and seventh pamphlets of the Bells and Pomegranate series. There were 37 poems, and reviewers noticed that even less than they did the plays. And there is no evidence that Browning had any great expectations from them. These poems were usually written quickly when an idea or occasion suggested itself, at moments when he was not about the serious business of writing a stage play. So therefore, Browningian, the important poems and the famous poems that we find here, these are to be found that to some extent Browning didn't have some serious intention behind writing these poems. But unfortunately, you see that it actually happens to our life, that when we try to make something serious, it becomes a complete failure. And when we do something without any seriousness, sometimes it becomes more famous. So that happens, you see. And here also the particular orientation is being there. Now, if you think about the important topics of My Last Duchess, then certainly the first topic would be that consider My Last Duchess as a dramatic monologue, number one. Number two, you know, the kind of orientation that is being found here in this particular poem regarding the temperament and the character and, you know, the kind of instinct that is working within the Duke, actually. It's the Duke of Ferrara. And to some extent, you will find that as the Duke is subjugating the Duchess, and there is a kind of a hint of killing her, so therefore, you have to point it out that somehow Duke of Ferrara is actually representing patriarchy. That means he is a representative of the patriarchy, he is a patriarch, and somehow the women's subjugation, the control, domination, exploitation, and even life threat and killing. So everything has to be associated with this particular man. And fundamentally, you will consider that this man is actually, to some extent, enjoying this very work. And towards the end of the particular poem, you will also find that somehow the poem is actually, to some extent, providing, in this particular poem, the Duke is actually providing a kind of a threat to the envoy. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, and ultimately he has been made a portrait now. Okay, she was a living person, and now she is no more. So consider yourself that if in future the lady for whom you are coming here, okay, you are bringing the proposal of marriage, and if she behaves in the same manner, probably I will say to any other envoy, that's my new last Duchess painted on the wall. That means she will certainly be killed if she doesn't follow my rules and regulations and obligatory principles that I will set. So that's a kind of a, you know, temperament that is being pointed out or that have been reflected in this particular poem. It is certainly representing that the Duke cannot be considered to be a good human being. Duke cannot be considered to be a tender person. Rather, you will consider that the Duke is actually representing patriarchy and how the exploitation, subjugation, cruelty, and everything is being pointed out here. This is one thing. Another thing that I should say here, you know, that whenever we will go through the poems of Browning, you have to keep it in mind that Browning is a Victorian poet, and fundamentally in the Victorianism, the typical orientations of Victorianism, we generally identify that there are ample references where the art form, that is the Victorian art form, are taken for consideration in the poems. That means there are some representations of the art form, that is Victorian art form, in the literature, obviously. Say, for example, if you think about Browningian taste of literature and Browningian taste of Victorian art, then ultimately you will find there are ample references of Browning's poems where the art forms have been deliberately being pointed out, they have been presented, they have been commented. To some extent, these are actually happening. Say, for example, if you think about Browning's famous two poems, the one is Fra Lippo Lippi and the second one is Andrea del Sarto. The first one is Fra Lippo Lippi and the second one is Andrea del Sarto. So what happens, you know, these are the two artists, okay, and actually Browning is writing this particular poem. It's a long poems, the two long poems written by Robert Browning. These are, to some extent, they are dealing with the lives of the painters, okay. Actually, Browning had a knowledge about the painters, about the artists, from a particular book, The Lives of the Italian Painters or the Renaissance Painters, and it was written by Giorgio Vasari. And what happens, that Browning had gone through this particular book in very detail. And fundamentally, he had known everything about the Victorian art form. He had known everything about the Victorian artists. And whenever he actually dealt with these painters like Andrea del Sarto or Fra Lippo, he's actually dealing with some kind of social criticism. He's writing in terms of some fresco painting that was very famous during the time of Lippo or del Sarto. So fundamentally, he was dealing with the lives of these painters, these Renaissance painters, and ultimately, what I must say here, that there are some provisions, there are some representations of the Victorian art and Victorian painting in these poems in detail. You can find a closer look to the poems, and then you will get a glimpse that how Victorian literature can, to some extent, represent themselves as, something critical about. I'm not saying in terms of negative criticism. There is something positive criticism, and obviously some negative orientations to religion and so in these poems. Now, why I'm stating this? Because in most of the poems, whether it is My Last Duchess or it is My Last Ride Together, everywhere you will find some art form has been incorporated. So, for example, if you think about this particular poem, that is My Last Duchess, you will find certainly that in this poem, Browning has pointed out one particular painter, and his name is Fra Pandolf. Okay. Now, what happens, this Fra Pandolf, or Pandolf actually, Pandloff, Fra Pandolf, he is engaged in painting the portrait of the lady, that is the last Duchess. Okay. And fundamentally, there is Lucretia, obviously. And ultimately, you will find that somehow the painting was so lifelike that it creates a kind of suspicion among or within this particular man, that is the Duke of Duke Alfonso. Now, it is not simply that. So ultimately, you will find that the painting, that is the representation of Victorian art form, is being presented in this particular poem. At the same time, you will find the similar kind of orientation has been made towards the end of the poem, where there is a particular sculpture of Neptune taming the seahorse is being pointed out. Okay, and that will obviously say something about, again, another particular reference to Victorian art form itself. There was a reference to a sculpture, therefore, the Italian Renaissance setting is actually helping this particular poem to, to sustain the moral judgment of the Duke, and ultimately it focuses on the presence of the Victorian, to some extent, the Victorian worldliness, and the differentiations of in terms of the human psyche, and fundamentally they are also commenting on the Victorian art form in general. The reference of the clause of Innsbruck, who has cast in bronze for me the Neptune taming the seahorse, etc. So here also, what I'm trying to suggest here, that as Victorian period is obviously famous for its art form, and as we can find that Browning was one among the admirers of the Victorian art form, and wherever the situation demands, wherever he had found any particular provision of pointing this art or commenting on the art forms in his poems, he had deliberately done this. So therefore, I must say here, in this particular poem, that is My Last Duchess, it is also being done, just like the other poems like Fra Lippo and del Sarto, or maybe Last Ride Together. And similarly, here you will find certainly that Browning is doing the same. Okay, here also the reference of Pandolf, or maybe the clause of Innsbruck, okay, that have been pointed at the last line of this particular poem. I will come to that later. Now, what happens, that as I've already mentioned, there is a dramatic monologue. So therefore, you will find certainly that the poem actually begins as if in a form of a conversation. As I've already mentioned, that in case of dramatic monologue, we find that there is a silent listener being present, but at the same time, you cannot find any particular word of the silent speaker or listener being incorporated in this particular poem. But ultimately, what we can trace, what we can identify, that's probably the person, that is the envoy who is present along with the Duke. He had asked the Duke about the painting, what is there, and somehow he was very much astonished, he was very much surprised to just see that, the kind of look that it represents. That means the glow, okay, or maybe the luster, or maybe the kind of mood or kind of emotion that the painting actually reflects, the question certainly arises within this person that how can it be possible that such a kind of a glow, such a kind of a look is present within this lady. Remember, it is the typical patriarchal orientation to this particular text, when you will find that the female characters or the women, they have been completely being imprisoned within the periphery of the patriarchal designs. So you cannot expose yourself, you cannot expose even your feelings, even your temperament. So whenever a painting is reflecting, it's a lifelike impressionistic painting that has been pointed out. Okay, it is not the time when the impressionistic painting had been converted into expressionistic. It's not that. But here you will find that it is the lifelike presentation, is the lifelike orientation of the text, or lifelike orientation of the painting. So therefore, if it represents, if it reflects the emotion, the kind of feeling, the kind of expression of the woman, of this Duchess, then the question was that how can it be possible that such a kind of a glow, such a kind of a luster, such a kind of an emotion can be present within the woman in front of a strange person, in front of a person who is completely unrecognizable to her. Okay, because that kind of emotion that it reflects, that it shows, it must appear in front of her lover, in front of her husband, in front of her fiance. Then how can it be possible that the same emotion gets reflected in front of the painter? Okay, the kind of blush that is being visible in this particular painting and so on. So that's why the question certainly arises, the question that have been aroused by the patriarchal representatives, whether it was the envoy, whether it was the duke. It is actually focusing at, to some extent, you see that it is focusing at the temperament, the kind of, kind of character, rather, the character of the woman in general. That means regarding the character of the woman, regarding the temperament of the woman, a question has been asked. And this particular question is not being asked by this man or maybe the duke. Rather, it is a question that has been asked by the patriarchal representatives. Okay, so that's why you will find that somehow it's a kind of a justification that the duke is operating here. The duke says, I'm beginning, it's pointing. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall. So you see here in this particular demonstration that he is actually showing, that is my last Duchess. That's my last Duchess. So ultimately, you will identify certainly that here the authority, power, and omnipotence, all these are getting reflected in the temperament of the speaker. As I've mentioned, my last Duchess. If you think about this particular title, my last Duchess, if you break these terms, then you will find this particular term is a possessive term. Okay, that means if you classify them in terms of its categories, category of term, this particular term is referring to the possessive, first person possessive. Okay, if you think about a last, it is the general ordinal. And Duchess, it is obviously referring to any particular woman. And remember, this particular title, Duchess, it is also a respective term. That means you will find that this particular term is dependent on the term duke. So there is no particular name has been mentioned. So ultimately, if you think about the three terms, my last Duchess, you will find that the authority is being incorporated here. Why? Because if you think about the possessive term, my, then obviously you will find it is a kind of a proprietorship that is being pointed out. My last Duchess, remember? So ultimately, I am the proprietor. I am the master actually. So it is my last Duchess. It's nobody else's. So therefore, I must possess authority over her. Second, the term last. It indicates, that means there are ample references of the Duchesses. So she was the last Duchess, remember. And last cannot be last until the newer one comes. Okay. So when the newer one comes, she no longer retains the particular term last, therefore. So this is obviously indicating towards the particular possibility of changeability. So again, you will find that the Duchess, or maybe the lady, regarding her position even after death, it is also shifting. যেটা বলছিলাম যে তিনটে টার্ম দেখো এখানে রয়েছে, আমি বলছি my last and duchess. So my represents something possessive, last represents something in terms of general ordinal. So ultimately it is also shifting, as I'm trying to suggest here, that you know that this particular kind of a shift, the shifting is there, you know, that in one, so think about any particular woman in her lifetime. Fundamentally what happens that whenever there is a particular possibility of a woman in her positioning, then you will find each and every moment the patriarchal society makes her feel to be, you know, shifting in all moments. When you are somebody's daughter, when you are somebody's wife, when you are somebody's mother, okay, so each and every moment you will find that your positioning, your presence, it is gradually shifting each and every moment. And here also you will find that my duchess, it is not that my last duchess. Then if you certainly think or consider that again the position or maybe the recognition, it is also shifting even after death. So that's why it is actually indicating towards the females, okay, and their positioning, which are gradually shifting, or it is not the typical, you know, existential crisis that has been pointed out regarding identity and regarding positions and something. Again, the term duchess, as you can see here, the duchess, this very term is actually indicating to some extent that when you say somebody duchess, that means you have to be conscious about the duke. That means as the duke is present, so therefore there is the duchess. So duchess is obviously being considered as a diminutive of the duke. So ultimately, as there is a duke, so there is a duchess. So ultimately the duchess is actually dependent on the existence of duke. So again, the particular title or regarding the titling, you will find that one particular labeling has been provided. So that's why the title, my last duchess, in this particular titling, you will find certainly that the patriarchy is working, and at the same time you will find that in this particular reference there is also a particular you know, orientations of subjugations and exploitations and possessiveness, and you know, the existential crisis of a woman. Everything has been indicated, okay, not overtly stated. And now when it says that that's my last duchess painted on the wall, so here you will find that somehow the duke, or maybe the speaker of this particular poem, he has the authority, he has the to some extent pride, or he is the proud man regarding showing this particular authority, and that's why it says that is my last duchess painted on the wall. So when you are substantiating, or to some extent you are you know, transforming, or rather changing or altering a duchess into a painting, that means from a human being to a you know, a thing, okay, from a being to a thing, you see, that means from an animated subject to an you know, inanimated object. That particular change is very much problematic. It is very much, you know, it creates or problematizes the situation regarding the existence of a person, specifically the existence of a woman in a typical, or existence of a female in a typical patriarchal backdrop. So that's why it says that is my last duchess painted on the wall and looking as if she were alive. That means it's a lifelike representation. As I mentioned that, you know, probably you will, if you go through the history of painting, then ultimately you will find that in the paintings of the Romantic and the Victorian artists, like Constable, like you know, these are the painters, you know, Fra Lippo and Del Sarto, the reference have been taken thereof. So ultimately you will find fundamentally that means the paintings are very much lifelike. If you think about the painting orientation, then you will obviously find that there are two particular types of painting, to be specific. One is considered as the impressionistic painting, you know, that actually represents a kind of an impression. It's the lifelike representation. Probably you have heard and you have gone through the typical painters like Constable, and you will find that what is happening outside, the same, you know, the same impressionistic painting has been painted by them. And if you think about the change, the shift from the impressionistic painting to the expressionistic, then you will find the expressions are much more important than the lifelike presentation, because the kind of a change was possible just because of the photography. That means whenever the photographs are coming into existence, that means taking photographs and camera and so, you cannot paint probably more lifelike than a photograph. Okay, so that's why there was no particular need anymore for the lifelike presentations and something. And as the time progresses, you will certainly find that somehow the kind of complexity that was gradually increasing, you see, the complex human mind and human self and the complex situations, because you will find that gradually it is moving towards the modernism, towards the particular time, that where everything has been in a chaos, as we know, First World War and something. So as it was moving, Victorian period means it's from 1830s, and modern period begins in 1910 and something. So ultimately, this long time period, that is from 1830s to 1910, ultimately you will find that somehow it's a kind of a shift. Okay, because Victorian period is nothing. I must say here that one particular orientation to Victorianism is it's a continuation of the Romantic period. And if you think about the modern period, then the modern period is obviously something anti-romantic in appeal, because it is to some extent realistic. It is to some extent an age of disillusionment. So certainly you will find the Victorian period is in between. So as the time progresses, as you can find, that the typical orientations of illusions that are found in the Romantic period, and that sustains to some extent in Victorian period, though you can find there is industrialization, there is obvious reference to economic crisis and economic orientation to that. Okay, all these are there. The realistic orientations are there. But the pattern of illusioning or illusions that have been, decked in the modern, in the Romantic period, to some extent, these sustain in the Victorian period too. And gradually, it is moving towards the age of disillusionment, this modern period. So certainly here also you will find that one particular orientation of Victorianism or Victorian period is this particular kind of a transition. Okay, towards the later part of the Victorian period, you will find that the transitional orientations are always there. You see, as I've already mentioned regarding the concept of faith and doubt, whether you will keep faith over the age-old convention that you were following, or rather you will create some kind of, it will be, you are doubtful actually regarding its existence, and now you're thinking about the new. So that's why regarding the temperament of these writers, whether it is Browning, whether it is the other poets, okay, the pre-Raphaelites, or maybe the Victorian novelists, Victorian period faith and doubt ব্যাপারটা রয়েছে, তুমি ওই দিকটাকে মেনে চলবে আগেরটাকে, নাকি নতুন কোনো কিছু নিয়ে ডাউটফুল হবে এবার, মানে এস্টাবলিশড নর্মস এন্ড স্ট্রাকচারস নিয়ে। তো যে কারণে আর কি আলটিমেটলি যে পদ্ধতিটা চলছিল, মানে একটা লাইফ লাইক প্রেজেন্টেশন, এবং তার জায়গা থেকে কিন্তু একটা এক্সপ্রেশনিজমে জাম্প রয়েছে এই সময়, এবং আলটিমেটলি it actually happens towards the end of this particular period. We find that the wholehearted jump into a new form of painting, a new form of art form that actually taken into consideration. এটা হয়েছিল আর কি। এবার যে কারণে আর কি তোমার এই যখন এই কবিতাটা আমরা পড়ছি, মানে এই যে দ্যাটস মাই লাস্ট স্পেন্ট অন দ্য ওয়াল লুকিং অ্যাজ ইফ অ্যালাইভ, সো দিস এই লুকিং অ্যাজ ইফ অ্যালাইভ এই ওরিয়েন্টেশনটা কিন্তু সামহাউ ইট ইজ অ্যাকচুয়ালি ফোকাসিং অন দ্য লাইফ লাইক পেইন্টিং রিপ্রেজেন্টেশন or lifelike painting itself. এটা কিন্তু একটা কাল্ট, মানে এটা একটা প্যাটার্ন অফ পেইন্টিং that was present during that time. So that's why it's very significant and very important therefore. So therefore it says that that's my last Duchess painted on the wall looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder. Now, so why it's wonder? Because it's wonderful, because such a kind of lifelike representation and lifelike painting it never had actually. Okay, so I call that piece a wonder. Now it says Fra Pandolf's hand were worked busily a day, and there she stands. So therefore you will find the particular name of Fra Pandolf. Now here in this particular text it has been stated as Fra Pandolf, but you will find that his name was Brother Pandolf, Pandolf, but here it is written Pandolf. Okay, he was the fictitious painter from the monastic orders who has been commissioned to paint the portrait of the Duchess. Okay, so now it's written that this Fra Pandolf's hands, he worked busily a day, the whole day, you see, and there she stands. You can just take a look that she is standing there. Okay, And then it says that will it please you to sit and look at her. So that's why there is a particular position you see, and probably an ottoman or sofa-like thing. And as the envoy was present there, and the Duke is stating, just sit there and just look at her. I see Fra Pandolf by design. Okay. For never read strangers like you that picture countenance. That means, what it states that here, as I've already mentioned, that the Duke, the way Duke has been presented here, the Duke is obviously, he is representing patriarchy. He is the possessive patriarch. And ultimately, as I've mentioned, that the Duke has to be treated as, the proprietor. Okay, the proprietorship that he is dumping upon the Duchess. But after the death of the Duchess, regarding the painting also, that very proprietorship is continuing. It says that Fra Pandolf's hands work busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you to sit and look at her? I said Fra Pandolf by design, okay, because it was my intention, and ultimately it was my design, and it was I who actually gave the permission here, and therefore by design means it is according to my thinking, according to my thought processes. It says that Fra Pandolf by design for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance. Countenance means, it's a kind of facial expression. And if you can just take a look at the facial expression that the painting actually represents, okay, the painting actually shows, you will find that the strangers like you, they never find that particular picture countenance, because I do not permit them, you see. So that's why it is being pointed out that when I am stating that I do not give permission to others to just take a look at my Duchess's painting or the painting of my Duchess, then it actually shows that it is my design that is working each and every moment. I said Fra Pandolf by design. That means I do not permit any other person except you. Like, you are just sitting there and looking at her. But ultimately, I never gave permission to others to look at my Duchess's painting. Even the proprietorship is there, you see. So I said Fra Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that picture countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance, but to myself they turned. So, whenever I actually gave permission to any person to look at the painting, then certainly most of them, okay, they just take a look at the painting and find the expression that is present within this painting, and they certainly just move back and ask me that how such a countenance, how such an expression can be visible from the eyes of the lady. How can it be possible? Because I know very well, okay, because each and everywhere, you see that how can it be possible that such expression gets reflected from the lady's eyes? Because probably you were not present at the time when the painting was drawn. So you can identify, you can feel that the insinuation, to some extent criticism, the point is towards the character of the lady. It says that Fra Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. So it was probably just because of Fra Pandolf who was present there that such a kind of countenance, such a kind of facial expression was visible. Okay? So that's why it says the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I. So you see the bracket. As I've mentioned, the proprietorship that the Duke is actually exercising, that has been pointed out in the within these lines actually. Since none puts by the curtain. So nobody dared to put by the curtain I have drawn for you except I. But I means except I. That means after death also, I have the proprietorship, I have the mastery, I am the master, and that's why only I can put the curtain aside. So that's why it says that, whenever any particular person, it's according to my design, obviously, if I want anybody to look at the painting, then only he can be able to look at the painting. But whenever I gave permission to any person, the similar kind of reaction that you are actually showing, the similar kind of reaction can be found to be visible from any other person, because they were very much suspicious. They were very much, astonished and surprised to find such a kind of reaction, such a kind of expression from the eyes, from the facial countenance of the Duchess. So that's why she says that strangers like you, the picture countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance, but to myself they turned. Since none puts by the curtain, I have drawn for you but I. And seemed as they would ask me if they durst. D-U-R-S-T, it's an archaic term, it means dare actually. If they dared to ask me, then it seemed that they would ask me. What would they ask? They would ask me how such a glance came there. So, not the first are you to turn and ask thus. So, it seems as if that here you will find that this person, maybe the envoy who is present there, it is probably the envoy is asking the Duke regarding the possibility of, or regarding the presence of such an expression within the eyes of the Duchess. The question is how. So that's why up to this particular section we have found that somehow the question has been asked. It is not the question of the envoy, rather it is spoken by the Duke. And it is obviously a particular question that has been asked by the patriarchal representatives and patriarchy against a woman, against a female, that how can it be possible that you can just look at the person with such a kind of an expression, because that very expression can only be related with the proprietors. So how can it be possible that you are looking with such an expression to a stranger? And then say, sir, and now the answer is provided. You see. He says, sir, it was not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. So you will probably identify, as I've already mentioned, that the primary focus is being associated, is being pointed to the particular kind of orientation of the character of the Duchess. So here it says that, sir, it was not her husband's presence only. So the kind of blush that is appearing, the spot of joy being blush. So the kind of blush that is appearing in the cheeks of the Duchess, you see, you cannot say that it is just because of her husband's presence. No, it is not that. So that's why it says that it is not the kind of love and kind of emotion that she actually has, or had rather, for me only, that creates such kind of spot of joy or the blush. So it is indicated or maybe insinuated that it was due to the kind of joy that she felt being exposed to some extent to or in front of the outsider. That means the painter. Probably some of the words of the painter, it actually creates a kind of joy in her mind, and somehow that gets reflected in the form of the spot of joy. That means the blush. So again, the focus is at the insinuation towards the character. So that's why it says that, sir, it was not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say. So it might be that Fra Pandolf was there and she was stating, he said, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much. Probably he was saying that the mantle that you were wearing, it is covering your wrist too much. Okay. So what does it implicate? Probably it is stating that you must expose a bit little. And that's why it is actually providing that the wrist is too beautiful to be hidden. You must not hide your wrist too much. You must expose some part of your body because it is very beautiful. So that's why probably Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps or covers over my lady's wrist too much. Or probably he is speaking, he is saying that paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush that dies along the throat. What does it mean? That means so beautiful the Duchess was. It was not within the capability, within the ability of the painter to paint that very beauty in its proper form. The painters were unable. So beautiful you are, it could not be reflected, it could not be painted anywhere. You know, the kind of beauty, the kind of subtlety of her expression, it cannot be reproduced in painting. So that is the thing that probably the painter may be asked or said. Number one, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much. Or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush, the beauty, the moving beauty, the beauty of expression that is gradually appearing and vanishing even in a minute. So it cannot be reproduced in any form of art. It is beyond the capability, beyond the ability of any person to reproduce them. That's why it says, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush that dies along her throat, that is vanishing through her throat. Then it says, such stuff was courtesy, she thought. You know, it has been stated that it's a courtesy. What does courtesy mean? Or what does the expression says? The worldview went to say is the Duchess's naivete and ignorance of social and class differences infuriates the Duke. Remember, the Duke was very proud and snob personality, as she was the Duchess. So ultimately, the Duke expected the Duchess to perform the same, to behave the same, to feel the same. Now, a painter from the streets, it seems to be the Duke, to the Duke, that a painter from the street even, a painter of very, lower quality, so far as the Duke's position is concerned, in response to that, the lower class painter, when he can say such kind of words in front of the quote-unquote Duchess, you see, the Duchess of high repute, the Duchess of high status. It was considered by the Duchess, she was so simple actually. It seemed to be a thing like courtesy to her, but it was not so. So that's why here it states that the ignorance of the social and class difference of the Duchess, it infuriated the Duke. He talks about her earnest glance and passion with utter scorn. So therefore, the kind of simplicity that the Duchess had, the Duke did not like that. So therefore, he says, such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She considered it as, courtesy, and probably that's why she never protested, and probably she thought it was the cause enough for calling up that particular blush.